The wine glass shattered against marble like her dreams had 3 years ago. Vivienne Caldwell watched burgundy liquid seep across billionaire Sterling Whitmore's handmade Italian shoes, the silent restaurant holding its collective breath. His face darkened with rage as he rose, 6'3" of corporate power and old money arrogance towering over her. "Do you have any idea who I am?" His voice carried the weight of board meetings and broken lives. "I could end your pathetic little existence with one phone call." The dining room froze, cameras secretly recording, staff trembling. Vivienne met his gaze with arctic calm, her words cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "I've already been destroyed once, Mr. Whitmore. Good luck trying again." She didn't know that he would remember those words during his arrest, or that she was already 10 steps ahead. The crystal chandeliers of Le Bernardin cast prismatic light across white tablecloths as Vivienne Caldwell balanced the wine tray with practiced precision. Her uniform pressed sharp, her smile professionally vacant. She moved through the dining room like a ghost navigating memories. The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of Manhattan's elite, their voices carrying stock tips and merger whispers over $30 appetizers. She'd served these people for 6 months now, invisible in plain sight, watching them devour more than just their overpriced meals. Tonight felt different, electric with possibility, though none of the patrons seemed to notice the shift in the air. Vivienne had learned to read rooms like war maps, studying the terrain of power and privilege that once belonged to her. From wherever you're watching this unfold, you'll want to comment below about what you think happens next, because this story takes turns that even seasoned viewers won't see coming. Sterling Whitmore commanded table 12 like a king holding court, his silver hair gleaming under the warm light as he gestured expansively to his dinner companions. His Armani suit probably cost more than most people made in 3 months, and he wore it with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never known want. Vivienne had studied his patterns for weeks, memorizing his preferences, his habits, his tells. He liked his wine decanted exactly 45 minutes before serving, his water glass never empty, his ego constantly stroked by whoever happened to be buying dinner. Tonight, he was entertaining Japanese investors, men whose quiet dignity contrasted sharply with Sterling's booming laughter and performative charm. As she approached their table with the 1997 Bordeaux he'd specifically requested, Vivienne felt her pulse steady into the rhythm of inevitability. Every step had been planned, every angle calculated, every word rehearsed. The only variable was Sterling himself, and she'd been studying him long enough to predict even his surprises. The collision happened exactly as she'd designed it. Sterling's elbow swept wide as he punctuated some story about quarterly profits, catching Vivienne's wrist just as she leaned forward with the wine. The bottle tilted, gravity claiming its prize, and burgundy liquid cascaded across Sterling's lap in a crimson arc that seemed to hang in the air for an impossible moment. The restaurant fell silent as if someone had cut the soundtrack to their lives, every conversation dying mid-sentence, every fork pausing halfway to its destination. Sterling shot to his feet with a roar of outrage that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, his face cycling through shock, fury, and something darker that Vivienne recognized from courtrooms and boardrooms where men like him destroyed lives with casual indifference. She remained perfectly still, her expression neutral, watching him inflate with rage like a balloon ready to burst. This was the moment she'd been building toward for 3 years, and it felt both anticlimactic and earth-shattering, like watching a controlled demolition from the inside. Sterling's voice boomed across the dining room with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Do you have any idea who I am? I could end your pathetic little existence with one phone call. Your manager, your landlord, every job you'll ever apply for. I'll make sure they know exactly what kind of incompetent disaster you are." His words dripped with the casual cruelty of a man who'd perfected the art of humiliation, each syllable designed to strip away dignity like paint thinner eating through veneer. The other diners watched with the morbid fascination of people witnessing a car crash, some recording with their phones, others simply staring with the kind of hungry attention that fed off others' misfortune. Vivienne felt their eyes on her like searchlights, illuminating her supposed shame for their entertainment. She'd been in this position before, 3 years ago, when Sterling had destroyed her career with the same casual malice. But this time, she was ready. This time, she had a response that would haunt him long after tonight's wine had been cleaned from his expensive suit. Vivienne met Sterling's gaze with the kind of calm that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Her voice cut through his bluster like ice water through fire, each word precisely articulated and heavy with implications he couldn't yet understand. "I've already been destroyed once, Mr. Whitmore. Good luck trying again." The silence that followed was deafening, pregnant with possibilities and unspoken threats that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. Sterling's face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, recognition trying to surface, and something that might have been the first whisper of fear. He couldn't place her, couldn't quite grasp why her response felt like a challenge rather than an apology, but some primitive instinct was telling him that this woman was dangerous in ways he hadn't anticipated. The other diners leaned forward unconsciously, sensing drama that went deeper than spilled wine and wounded pride. Vivienne remained perfectly still, her uniform wrinkled but her spine straight, watching Sterling wrestle with the unsettling feeling that he'd just walked into a trap. Donovan Pierce materialized beside their table with the frantic energy of a man whose livelihood depended on keeping wealthy customers happy. The restaurant manager's face was flushed with embarrassment and barely contained panic as he surveyed the wine stain spreading across Sterling's suit like a crimson accusation. "Mr. Whitmore, I am so terribly sorry. This is completely unacceptable, and I assure you there will be immediate consequences." His voice carried the desperate edge of someone who understood that Sterling Whitmore's displeasure could destroy more than just one waitress's job. Donovan's eyes flicked between Sterling's furious face and Vivienne's eerily calm expression, trying to read a situation that felt loaded with subtext he couldn't parse. The other staff members hovered at the edges of the dining room like vultures circling roadkill, their faces mixing sympathy for Vivienne with relief that they weren't the ones in the spotlight. Donovan straightened his tie with shaking hands and delivered the verdict that everyone knew was coming. "Ms. Caldwell, you're terminated, effective immediately. Please gather your things and leave the premises." Vivienne nodded once, accepting her dismissal with the same serene composure that had marked her response to Sterling's threats. She began gathering the broken pieces of the wine glass, her movements deliberate and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. As she knelt to collect a shard that had skittered under Sterling's chair, her fingers closed around something else entirely, a small, ornate cufflink that must have fallen from his jacket during his dramatic rise. The metal was warm against her palm, heavy with significance that went far beyond its material value. She slipped it into her pocket with the smooth efficiency of a pickpocket, though her theft had nothing to do with the cufflink's worth and everything to do with what it represented. Sterling watched her with growing unease, his anger slowly being replaced by something that felt uncomfortably like vulnerability. There was something about this woman's calm acceptance, her lack of tears or pleas for mercy, that unsettled him more than if she'd collapsed in hysterics. As Vivienne rose and smoothed her uniform one final time, Sterling caught a glimpse of something in her eyes: calculation, intelligence, and a patience that suggested this encounter was far from over. Vivienne walked through the dining room toward the employee exit, her steps measured and purposeful despite the weight of dozens of stares following her progress. She didn't look back at Sterling, didn't acknowledge the whispered conversations that erupted in her wake, didn't give any sign that this moment marked anything more significant than a clumsy waitress losing her job. But her fingers worried the stolen cufflink in her pocket like a talisman, and her mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating the ripple effects of tonight's performance. The other staff members watched her go with a mixture of pity and admiration. Pity for her circumstances, admiration for her dignity in the face of public humiliation. They couldn't know that Vivienne felt neither humiliated nor defeated, that every moment of tonight's encounter had unfolded exactly as she'd planned. As she pushed through the kitchen doors and headed toward the employee lockers, Vivienne allowed herself the smallest smile. Phase 1 was complete. and Sterling Whitmore had no idea that his real problems were just beginning. The wine stain on his suit would fade, but the stain on his life would prove indelible. Sterling remained standing long after Vivienne had disappeared, his hand unconsciously moving to his jacket where the missing cufflink had been. The wine was already beginning to set into his suit, the burgundy darkening to the color of dried blood, but he barely noticed. Something about the woman's parting words echoed in his mind with the persistence of a song stuck on repeat. "I've already been destroyed once." The phrase carried implications that made his skin crawl, suggestions of history and purpose that transformed a simple accident into something far more sinister. He looked around the dining room, noting the way conversations had resumed, but with an undercurrent of excitement, the way phones were still recording, the way his humiliation was already being uploaded to social media for the world's entertainment. For the first time in years, Sterling Whitmore felt exposed, vulnerable, like a man who'd just discovered that the ground beneath his feet was actually a thin sheet of ice. He sat back down heavily, waving away Donovan's continued apologies, his mind already working to understand what had just happened and why it felt like the beginning rather than the end of something terrible. The elevator in Vivienne's building wheezed and groaned its way to the 14th floor, each mechanical complaint echoing her own exhaustion as she rode up to her tiny studio apartment. The hallway smelled of cooking oil and desperation, the kind of building where dreams came to die and people learned to make peace with less than they'd hoped for. She fumbled with her keys in the dim light, muscle memory guiding her to the right one, while her mind remained focused on the weight of Sterling's cufflink in her pocket. The apartment that greeted her was spartanly furnished but meticulously organized, every surface clear except for the essentials that kept her alive and motivated. To any casual observer, it would look like the home of someone who'd given up, who'd accepted defeat and retreated into anonymity. They would be wrong. This apartment was a war room disguised as surrender, every bare wall and empty shelf a deliberate choice in service of a larger strategy. Vivienne set her purse on the small dining table and began the ritual that had sustained her for 3 years, the slow, careful removal of the mask she wore for the outside world. The uniform came off first, hung precisely in the tiny closet beside 5 identical sets that comprised her work wardrobe. Next came the sensible shoes, the minimal makeup, the simple ponytail that had made her forgettable to everyone except the one man who needed to remember her face. In the bathroom mirror, Vivienne studied her reflection with the critical eye of someone who'd learned to see herself as others saw her, unremarkable, unthreatening, exactly the kind of person who could move through elite spaces without attracting attention. She'd spent months perfecting this persona, studying the way wealthy people looked through service workers as if they were part of the furniture. It had been remarkably easy to become invisible, to trade her former identity as a rising corporate lawyer for the anonymous efficiency of someone whose existence served other people's comfort. The transformation had been as much about psychology as appearance, learning to shrink herself, to project deference and acceptance. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, she began to let that mask slip. The laptop emerged from its hiding place behind a false panel in the bathroom wall, its sleek surface incongruous with the shabby apartment that surrounded it. Vivienne powered it on and watched the multiple screens cascade open, each one representing a different thread in the web she'd been weaving around Sterling Whitmore and his associates. Financial records, email intercepts, recorded conversations, photograph surveillance. The digital dossier on Sterling's criminal activities would have impressed the FBI if they'd had access to it. But this wasn't about justice in the traditional sense, and Vivienne had long since lost faith in institutions that claimed to protect the innocent while enabling the guilty. She'd spent 2 years as a corporate lawyer watching men like Sterling bend rules until they broke, witnessing firsthand how money and influence could transform crimes into technicalities and victims into inconveniences. The law, she'd learned, was a luxury that only the powerless were required to follow. Her approach would be more direct, more personal, and infinitely more satisfying than anything the courts could provide. The files on Sterling filled 3 separate drives, Years of patient investigation disguised as random encounters and coincidental conversations. Vivienne had learned to be a chameleon, slipping into different roles as circumstances required. A new employee at companies Sterling was acquiring, a fellow guest at charity galas, a bartender at clubs where he conducted his most sensitive business. Each interaction had been carefully planned, each piece of information meticulously catalogued and cross-referenced with existing intelligence. She'd watched him destroy careers and companies with the casual indifference of a child pulling wings off flies, always careful to maintain legal deniability while orchestrating financial ruin for anyone who crossed him. The pattern was consistent, methodical, and utterly ruthless. Sterling didn't just defeat his enemies, he obliterated them, ensuring they could never recover or retaliate. It was a strategy that had served him well for decades, built on the assumption that his victims would be too broken to fight back. He'd never encountered someone with Vivienne's patience, intelligence, or resources. He'd never destroyed someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from his downfall. A soft chime from her phone interrupted her review of Sterling's latest acquisition target, a tech startup whose innovations threatened his stranglehold on the data management industry. The text message was brief and cryptic. Phase 1 complete? The sender was listed only as ER. But Vivienne knew the identity of the person behind those initials. Evangeline Reed had been her closest friend and ally at Morrison, Klein & Associates, the law firm where they'd both worked before Sterling's retaliation destroyed their careers. Where Vivienne had chosen the path of patient revenge, Evangeline had opted for a more traditional approach. Whistleblowing, congressional testimony, attempts to work within the system they'd once served. Both approaches had failed initially, but their combined efforts were finally bearing fruit. Evangeline's inside knowledge of Sterling's legal vulnerabilities, paired with Vivienne's evidence of his ongoing crimes, created a 1-2 punch that would be impossible for even Sterling's army of lawyers to defend against. Vivienne typed back a simple response. Phase 1 complete. Initiate Phase 2 on schedule. The revolution they'd planned in stolen moments and encrypted messages was finally beginning. The cufflink lay on her desk like a small golden monument to hubris, its surface engraved with Sterling's initials in flowing script that spoke of old money and older arrogance. Vivienne examined it under her desk lamp, noting the craftsmanship that suggested it was more than mere jewelry. The slight bulge in the metal, the almost imperceptible seam that indicated hidden components. She'd suspected Sterling of recording his own conversations as insurance against potential betrayals, but she'd never been able to prove it until now. The cufflink was a micro-recording device, probably custom-made, definitely illegal, and absolutely perfect for her purposes. Sterling had been documenting his own crimes for years, creating an audio diary of corruption that would make prosecutors weep with joy. All she had to do was access the data, copy the files, and decide how best to deploy them for maximum impact. The irony was delicious. Sterling's paranoia and need for control had just handed her the weapon she needed to destroy him. He'd been so concerned about others betraying him that he'd never considered the possibility of betraying himself. 3 years ago, Vivienne Caldwell had been a different person entirely. Ambitious, idealistic, naive enough to believe that hard work and moral clarity were sufficient protection against the predatory capitalism that Sterling embodied. She'd been a senior associate at Morrison, Klein & Associates, specializing in corporate compliance and ethics investigations. Ironically enough, her clients had trusted her to keep them on the right side of the law, and she'd taken that responsibility seriously, perhaps too seriously for her own good. When she discovered Sterling's systematic fraud in the Meridian Industries acquisition, she'd done what her training and conscience demanded. She'd reported it to the SEC, confident that justice would prevail and wrongdoing would be punished. She'd been young enough to believe that the system worked, that truth was stronger than money, that good always triumphed over evil. Sterling had disabused her of those notions with surgical precision, transforming her from crusading lawyer to cautionary tale in the span of 6 months. He destroyed her reputation, her career, her financial stability, and her faith in the institution she'd served. But he'd made one critical error. He'd left her alive, angry, and intelligent enough to plan the perfect revenge. The apartment fell silent except for the hum of the laptop's cooling fans and the distant murmur of traffic 14 floors below. Vivienne pulled up the timeline she'd created for Sterling's downfall, checking off today's objectives while reviewing tomorrow's targets. The wine incident had been carefully orchestrated to establish her as a threat Sterling couldn't ignore or dismiss, someone whose very existence would gnaw at his peace of mind. The stolen cufflink would provide her with evidence of crimes that even Sterling's most expensive lawyers couldn't rationalize away. And the patient work of the past 3 years, the financial intelligence, the network infiltration, the alliance with Evangeline, was finally ready to transition from preparation to execution. Sterling Whitmore had built his empire on the broken dreams of others, never imagining that one of his victims would possess the patience and skills necessary to bring that empire crashing down. He was about to learn that some people, when pushed far enough, don't break. They forge themselves into weapons sharp enough to cut through any defense. Tomorrow, the real war would begin. Sterling Whitmore's penthouse office occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Meridian building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Manhattan's skyline that never failed to remind visitors of their place in the hierarchy. He stood at those windows now, his reflection ghost-like against the city lights, nursing a scotch that cost more than most people's monthly salary, while his mind worked through the implications of last night's encounter. The wine stain on his suit had been professionally removed, but the memory of that woman's words lingered like smoke in his consciousness, refusing to dissipate despite his best efforts to dismiss them as the desperate bravado of a fired waitress. "I've already been destroyed once." The phrase echoed with a specificity that suggested personal history, intimate knowledge of what destruction felt like from the inside. Sterling had destroyed many people over the years. It was a necessary component of business success, he told himself. But he prided himself on being thorough, on ensuring that his victims stayed buried. The possibility that one of them had crawled out of their grave and was now circling him like a predator made his skin crawl with an unfamiliar sensation he was reluctant to identify as fear. The intercom buzzed with the efficiency that marked all interactions in Sterling's domain, his assistant's voice carrying the crisp professionalism that he demanded from everyone in his orbit. "Mr. Whitmore, Thaddeus Gray is here for your 9 o'clock appointment." Sterling turned from the window, composing his features into the mask of confident authority that had served him well for 3 decades of corporate warfare. Thaddeus Gray was the best private investigator money could buy, a former FBI agent who'd traded government service for the more lucrative world of corporate espionage and personal security. If anyone could identify the woman from last night and determine whether she posed a real threat, it would be Gray. Sterling settled behind his desk, a monument of polished mahogany that dominated the office like an altar to power, and gestured for his visitor to enter. Gray moved with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to hunting humans, his unremarkable appearance concealing a mind that could dissect lives with surgical precision. Sterling had used his services before, usually to neutralize threats before they became problems, and Gray's success rate was perfect. He'd never failed to deliver exactly what Sterling requested, no matter how morally questionable the assignment might be. Gray listened to Sterling's account of the previous evening with the focused attention of a professional assessing a problem, asking precise questions about timing, location, witnesses, and the specific words exchanged. He took notes in a cramped handwriting that looked like code, his face revealing nothing about his assessment of the situation's seriousness. When Sterling finished his recitation, Gray reviewed his notes silently before looking up with the kind of direct gaze that made powerful men uncomfortable. "Based on your description and the restaurant's employee records, her name is Vivienne Caldwell, 28 years old, has worked at Le Bernardin for 6 months. Clean employment history, no criminal background, no obvious connections to your business interests." Gray's report should have been reassuring, but something in his tone suggested there were complications he hadn't yet revealed. Sterling leaned forward, his instincts telling him that the surface information was deliberately incomplete, that Gray had discovered something more significant than a waitress with an attitude problem. The investigator's next words confirmed his suspicions with the kind of professional delivery that made bad news sound like a weather report. However, she's remarkably difficult to trace beyond 6 months ago. It's as if Vivienne Caldwell didn't exist before she started working at that restaurant. The implications of Gray's discovery settled over the office like a toxic cloud, transforming what should have been a simple background check into something far more ominous. People didn't just appear out of nowhere, especially not people with the kind of composure and intelligence that Sterling had witnessed last night. Someone had created the Vivienne Caldwell identity, had crafted it specifically for the purpose of infiltrating the world where Sterling moved, had invested months of effort into becoming the kind of invisible service worker who could observe without being noticed. The patience required for such a long-term deception suggested resources, motivation, and most terrifyingly, a specific target. Sterling felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that accompanied recognition of a genuine threat. The same chemical cocktail that had sharpened his instincts during hostile takeovers and boardroom coups. Someone was hunting him. Someone with the skills and determination to create an entirely new identity for the sole purpose of getting close to him. The question wasn't whether this represented a serious problem. It was whether he could identify and neutralize the threat before it destroyed him. Gray was already reaching for his phone, preparing to deploy resources that would strip away Vivienne Caldwell's carefully constructed facade layer by layer until her true identity stood exposed. Miles across the city, Vivienne moved through the kitchen of another high-end establishment with the same invisible efficiency that had served her at Le Bernardin, her temporary catering uniform allowing her to blend seamlessly into the background of Sterling's private dinner party. The Whitmore Foundation's annual board meeting was always held at the University Club, a bastion of old money and older prejudices where important decisions were made over 5-course meals and 30-year-old wine. She'd volunteered for the catering assignment through a staffing agency that specialized in providing temporary help for exclusive events, knowing that Sterling's security would focus on guests rather than service staff. The dining room buzzed with the kind of restrained conversation that occurred when powerful people gathered to discuss how their influence could be leveraged for maximum benefit. Sterling presided over the table like a king holding court, his earlier unease masked by the performance of confident leadership that had defined his public persona for decades. He had no idea that the woman who'd humiliated him 12 hours earlier was now serving his soup, recording his conversations, and cataloging every word for future use against him. The conversation turned to Sterling's latest acquisition target, a promising tech startup called Neuralink, whose breakthrough in artificial intelligence threatened to disrupt the entire data management industry. Sterling's current monopoly in that sector generated billions in revenue annually, but Neuralink's innovation could render his technology obsolete within 5 years. Rather than compete through innovation, Sterling had chosen his preferred method of neutralizing threats: acquisition followed by systematic destruction of anything that might challenge his dominance. The startup's young founders had no idea they were being circled by a predator who viewed their success as a personal affront requiring correction. Vivienne listened to Sterling outline his strategy with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying a particularly toxic species, marveling at how casually he discussed destroying lives and stifling innovation in service of his own greed. Every word was being recorded by the device hidden in her uniform collar, digital evidence that would eventually find its way to the SEC investigators who'd been trying to build a case against Sterling's anti-competitive practices for years. The irony was perfect. Sterling's arrogance and need to boast about his schemes would ultimately provide the rope for his own hanging. As the evening progressed, Vivienne noticed the subtle signs of Sterling's growing paranoia. The way his eyes tracked movement around the room, the manner in which he lowered his voice when discussing sensitive topics, the frequency with which he checked his phone for messages that never seemed to bring good news. Gray's investigation was clearly proceeding, probably discovering the carefully planted breadcrumbs that would lead him in circles without ever revealing her true identity. She'd spent 2 years constructing Vivienne Caldwell's background, creating a paper trail sophisticated enough to pass casual scrutiny while ensuring that deeper investigation would hit walls at precisely the right moments. Every document, every reference, every digital footprint had been crafted to support the narrative of a woman who'd experienced some unspecified trauma that required a fresh start and a new identity. The beauty of the deception lay in its partial truth. Vivienne really had been destroyed, really had needed to disappear and reinvent herself, really was someone Sterling should fear. The only lie was the suggestion that her transformation had been random rather than targeted, accidental rather than surgical in its precision and purpose. The dinner concluded with Sterling's traditional toast to the Foundation's mission of supporting innovation and entrepreneurship in American business, words that rang with hollow irony given the context of his earlier conversation about destroying neural link. Vivienne served the final course of dessert and coffee with the same professional invisibility that had marked her entire evening. Just another face in the army of service workers who enabled the lifestyles of Manhattan's elite. As the guests began to disperse, she caught fragments of conversations about market manipulation, regulatory capture, and the various ways that wealth could be converted into influence and power. These people lived in a bubble of privilege so complete that they'd forgotten how to see themselves as others saw them, how to recognize the moral implications of their actions, how to understand that their victims might someday find ways to strike back. Sterling shook hands and exchanged pleasantries with his departing guests, playing the role of gracious host while his eyes continued to scan the room for threats he couldn't name or identify. When his gaze fell on Vivienne for a moment, she saw the flicker of recognition trying to surface, quickly suppressed by the cognitive dissonance of seeing a familiar face in an unexpected context. He almost remembered her, almost made the connection, but the human mind's tendency to categorize people by their roles worked in her favor. Waitresses didn't become caterers in the world where Sterling lived. They simply disappeared into the vast anonymity of service workers who existed only to serve his comfort. As Vivienne packed up her equipment and prepared to leave through the service entrance, she reflected on the evening's intelligence gathering with the satisfaction of a chess player who just moved her queen into position for checkmate. Sterling's acquisition strategy for Neuralink was documented. His illegal coordination with supposedly independent board members was recorded, and his casual discussion of market manipulation would soon be transcribed and forwarded to the appropriate authorities. More importantly, she'd confirmed that Sterling's paranoia was growing, that Gray's investigation was proceeding exactly as she'd anticipated, and that her target was beginning to feel the psychological pressure that would eventually drive him to make the kinds of mistakes that would seal his fate. The Foundation dinner had been a perfect microcosm of everything wrong with the system Sterling represented. Wealthy people gathering to congratulate themselves on their virtue while planning the destruction of anyone who threatened their dominance. They spoke of innovation and entrepreneurship while actively working to suppress both, convinced that their actions were justified by their success and insulated from consequences by their wealth. Tonight had been about gathering evidence, but it had also been about reminding herself why Sterling Whitmore deserved everything that was coming to him. Justice might be blind, but revenge had perfect vision. The trading floor at Goldman Sachs hummed with its usual morning chaos, hundreds of voices creating a symphony of greed and ambition that had been playing the same tune for decades. Evangeline Reed sat at her terminal like a conductor preparing to orchestrate financial destruction, her fingers hovering over keys that would trigger the first phase of Sterling Whitmore's economic downfall. She'd spent 3 years rebuilding her career after Sterling's retaliation had cost her everything, clawing her way back from professional exile through sheer determination and carefully concealed rage. Now she held a position at one of Wall Street's most prestigious firms, with access to trading systems and market intelligence that made her infinitely more dangerous than Sterling could possibly imagine. Her colleagues saw her as another ambitious analyst hungry for success, never suspecting that her real ambition was apocalyptic in scope. The morning briefing had just concluded. Market positions were being established, and Evangeline was ready to begin the careful demolition of Sterling's financial empire. Every transaction would appear legitimate, every move defensible, every action part of the natural chaos that defined modern capitalism. The first target was Whitmore Industries' stock price, currently trading at an artificially inflated level that reflected Sterling's reputation rather than his company's actual performance. Evangeline had spent months analyzing the technical indicators, identifying the precise pressure points where strategic selling could trigger automated trading systems and create a cascade effect. She began placing orders through shell corporations and offshore accounts that Vivienne had established, each transaction small enough to avoid detection while contributing to a growing pattern that would eventually become impossible to ignore. The beauty of modern markets was their susceptibility to psychological manipulation. Confidence could be shattered as easily as it was built, and Sterling's empire was more fragile than it appeared. His company's success depended on maintaining the illusion of invincibility, on convincing investors that Sterling Whitmore was too smart and too ruthless to fail. Evangeline was about to test that assumption with surgical precision, using Sterling's own arrogance against him like a weapon forged from his greatest weakness. Across town, Vivienne was implementing the second phase of their coordinated attack, using Sterling's stolen cufflink to access voice recordings that painted a damning picture of systematic fraud and market manipulation. The audio files contained conversations spanning 5 years, documenting Sterling's illegal activities with the casual confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. She uploaded selected excerpts to secure servers controlled by investigative journalists and regulatory officials who'd been trying to build cases against Sterling for years, providing them with evidence so compelling that even Sterling's army of lawyers would struggle to explain it away. The timing was critical. The recordings needed to surface just as Evangeline's trading activities began affecting Whitmore Industries' market position, creating a 1-2 punch that would leave Sterling reeling and vulnerable. Each leaked conversation was carefully chosen for maximum impact, revealing not just Sterling's crimes, but his contempt for the institutions and people he'd manipulated. The audio of him laughing about destroying that idealistic bitch who thought she could take down Sterling Whitmore would be particularly effective when paired with documentation of how he'd framed Vivienne for embezzlement. The call came at exactly 11:30. Just as Evangeline's trading algorithms began generating the kind of selling pressure that triggered automated responses across the market. Sterling's voice carried the strain of someone trying to maintain control, while everything familiar began to crumble beneath his feet. "Someone is attacking us," he said without preamble, his usual commanding tone replaced by something that might have been panic. "Our stock is down 8% in 2 hours, and I'm getting calls from reporters asking about audio recordings I've never heard before." Evangeline listened with the satisfaction of an artist hearing her work appreciated for the first time, though she was careful to inject the appropriate amount of concern into her voice. She'd maintained contact with Sterling through a false identity that portrayed her as a sympathetic ally, someone who'd escaped Vivienne's vendetta and was grateful for Sterling's protection. The irony of Sterling seeking comfort from one of his intended victims was delicious, though she couldn't afford to reveal her amusement. Her role required her to be supportive, helpful, and completely above suspicion, while the walls closed in around Sterling's empire. "The recordings," Sterling continued, his voice tight with an emotion that might have been fear. "They sound like me, but I never said those things. Someone is using voice synthesis technology to create false evidence, trying to frame me for crimes I didn't commit." The desperate rationalization in his voice was almost pathetic, the sound of a man whose reality was colliding with consequences he'd never imagined possible. Evangeline made sympathetic noises while simultaneously executing another round of strategic trades that would drive Whitmore Industries' stock price even lower. Sterling was experiencing the same disorientation that Vivienne had felt 3 years ago, the same sickening realization that everything he'd built could be destroyed by forces beyond his control. The difference was that Sterling's destruction was earned, deserved, and long overdue. His victims had been innocent people trying to do the right thing. Sterling was a predator who'd finally encountered a more skilled hunter. The symmetry was perfect, the justice poetic, and the satisfaction almost overwhelming in its intensity and completeness. The SEC announcement came at 2:15, released during the busiest part of the trading day for maximum market impact. The Securities and Exchange Commission has opened a formal investigation into allegations of market manipulation, fraud, and anti-competitive practices by Whitmore Industries and its subsidiaries. The investigation follows the receipt of substantial evidence suggesting systematic violations of federal securities laws spanning multiple years. Whitmore Industries' stock price immediately entered freefall, dropping 23% in 15 minutes as investors fled anything connected to Sterling's name. The audio recordings had been leaked to every major financial news outlet simultaneously, creating a media feeding frenzy that made denial impossible and damage control laughably inadequate. Sterling's carefully constructed reputation was collapsing in real time, broadcast live to millions of viewers who were watching one of Wall Street's most feared operators reduced to just another white-collar criminal facing justice. Evangeline watched the carnage unfold on her terminal with the detached fascination of someone observing natural selection in action, marveling at how quickly certainty could transform into chaos when the right pressure was applied at precisely the right moment. The afternoon brought a cascade of revelations that buried Sterling deeper with each new disclosure. Journalists who'd been investigating his activities for years suddenly found sources willing to talk. Former employees emerged from the shadows to share their stories of intimidation and retaliation, and prosecutors began connecting dots they'd been unable to see before. The voice recordings provided a skeleton key that unlocked years of speculation and suspicion, transforming whispered rumors into documented facts that could withstand courtroom scrutiny. Sterling's network of corrupt allies began distancing themselves with the speed of rats abandoning a sinking ship, each defection further isolating him from the power structures that had protected him for so long. By market close, Whitmore Industries had lost 42% of its value, billions of dollars in market capitalization simply evaporating as investors recognized that Sterling's empire was built on foundations of fraud and deception. The man who destroyed countless lives through financial manipulation was now experiencing the same treatment, helplessly watching his life's work crumble while the mechanisms he'd used against others turned their attention to him. As evening fell over Manhattan, Vivienne and Evangeline met in a small cafe in Greenwich Village. Two women whose lives had been shattered by the same man now sharing the satisfaction of watching their careful planning begin to bear fruit. They didn't celebrate. The work was far from finished, and Sterling still possessed resources and connections that could make him dangerous even in decline. But they allowed themselves a moment of quiet satisfaction, acknowledging that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied, that patience and preparation could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. Sterling Whitmore had spent years believing that his wealth and influence made him invulnerable, that his victims would stay buried and his crimes would remain hidden. He was about to learn that some wounds never heal, some victims never forget, and some debts can only be paid in full. The Queen's gambit had been played, the board was set, and Sterling's king was now in check with nowhere to run. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new ways to tighten the noose around the neck of a man who'd forgotten that every action has consequences, even for those who believe themselves above the law. Sterling Whitmore's world was collapsing with the methodical precision of a controlled demolition, each revelation timed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing his ability to mount an effective defense. The morning papers carried headlines that would have been unthinkable just 48 hours earlier. Wall Street Titan falls as federal investigation expands, and the Whitmore Empire, built on fraud, destined for destruction. His legal team, the same high-priced attorneys who'd helped him destroy countless opponents, now wore the haunted expressions of people who understood that their client's situation was essentially hopeless. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The public relations disaster was beyond salvage, and the federal prosecutors were already discussing plea negotiations that would still result in decades behind bars. Sterling sat in his office like a general watching his army disintegrate, fielding calls from panicked board members, angry investors, and former allies who were now primarily concerned with limiting their own exposure to the spreading scandal. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was experiencing the same isolation and desperation that he'd inflicted on so many others, though he lacked the emotional capacity to appreciate the poetic justice of his situation. The breakthrough in Thaddeus Gray's investigation came at exactly the wrong moment, arriving as Sterling's world was already burning and adding gasoline to flames that were rapidly consuming everything he'd built. "I found her," Gray announced as he entered Sterling's office without waiting for permission. his usual professional composure cracked by what he'd discovered. Vivienne Caldwell is actually Vivienne Morrison, formerly a senior associate at Morrison Klein & Associates. She was the whistleblower who triggered your SEC problems 3 years ago. The words hit Sterling like physical blows, each revelation confirming suspicions that had been gnawing at him since their encounter at the restaurant. She hadn't been a random waitress with an attitude problem. She'd been a ghost returned from the grave, a victim who'd refused to stay buried. A reminder that some people possess the patience and intelligence necessary to orchestrate perfect revenge. Gray continued his briefing with the mechanical delivery of someone reading from a death certificate, detailing how Sterling's retaliation had destroyed Vivienne's legal career, her financial stability, and her faith in the justice system that had failed to protect her from corporate vengeance. "She's been planning this for 3 years, Gray concluded, his voice carrying the professional admiration that one predator reserves for a superior hunter. "Everything we're seeing now, the stock manipulation, the leaked recordings, the federal investigation, it's all connected to her. She built a new identity, infiltrated your world, gathered evidence, and coordinated with allies we're still trying to identify." Sterling felt something cold and alien settling in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced since childhood and couldn't immediately recognize. Fear. Not the manageable anxiety of business risks or regulatory challenges, but the primal terror of prey realizing it was being stalked by something infinitely more dangerous than itself. Vivienne Morrison had dedicated 3 years of her life to studying his vulnerabilities, learning his patterns, and preparing weapons specifically designed to destroy him. She knew his business better than some of his own executives, understood his psychology better than his therapists, and possessed evidence of crimes that even he'd forgotten committing. The hunter had become the hunted, and Sterling was beginning to understand that he was facing an opponent who fought with the desperate intelligence of someone who had nothing left to lose. The address Gray provided led Sterling to a neighborhood he'd never visited, a part of Manhattan where ambition came to die, and dreams were measured in survival rather than success. He brought 2 bodyguards, men whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned, but whose competence was beyond question. The building was exactly what he'd expected. Tired, worn. The kind of place where people went to disappear from lives that had become unbearable. Sterling felt his disgust mixing with something that might have been respect, as he considered the psychological strength required to live in such surroundings while planning the destruction of someone infinitely more powerful. Vivienne Morrison had transformed herself into a weapon specifically designed for his destruction, and the precision of her campaign suggested an intelligence that matched his own. As they climbed the stairs to the 14th floor, Sterling found himself wondering if he'd underestimated all of his victims. If there were others out there nursing grievances and plotting revenge with the same methodical patience that Vivienne had demonstrated. The thought made his skin crawl with implications he wasn't ready to fully consider. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman whose appearance had been carefully calculated to project strength rather than vulnerability. Gone was the deferential posture of the waitress, replaced by the confident bearing of someone who'd reclaimed her power and intended to use it. Vivienne regarded him with the kind of clinical interest that a scientist might reserve for a particularly fascinating specimen, her eyes cataloging every detail of his appearance for future reference. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying none of the artificial deference he was accustomed to hearing from people in her supposed position. "I was wondering when you'd finally make the connection. Please come in. We have a lot to discuss." The apartment was Spartan but organized. Every surface clean and purposeful, like a command center disguised as a place of exile. Sterling's bodyguards flanked him with professional vigilance, but their presence felt inadequate against an opponent who fought with information and preparation rather than physical force. This woman had already demonstrated her ability to destroy him from a distance. Being in the same room with her felt like standing inside an armed explosive device. Vivienne moved through her small space with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to make the most of limited resources, gesturing for Sterling to take the only chair while she remained standing. The power dynamic was subtle but unmistakable. This was her territory, and he was the intruder, the one seeking answers rather than providing them. "You taught me everything I know about destroying lives," she said, her words carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of planning and preparation. The systematic approach, the attention to detail, the importance of cutting off all avenues of escape. I studied your methods like a graduate student, analyzing every move you made against me and others. Sterling felt his anger building, the familiar rage that had fueled his most successful campaigns. But something in Vivienne's expression warned him that emotional responses would be both useless and dangerous. She'd anticipated his anger, planned for his threats, prepared responses to every possible reaction he might have. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a presentation, a carefully orchestrated reveal designed to demonstrate just how thoroughly she'd outmaneuvered him. The beautiful thing about evidence, Vivienne continued, her tone conversational despite the gravity of her words, is that it exists independently of whether people want to acknowledge it. You've been documenting your own crimes for years, Mr. Whitmore, creating an audio diary that prosecutors dream about finding. She gestured toward a small device on her desk, Sterling's missing cufflink, now open to reveal sophisticated recording equipment that had captured hundreds of hours of incriminating conversations. Every illegal scheme, every act of retaliation, every moment when you revealed your true nature to people you thought you could trust. It's all there, waiting to be played in courtrooms and congressional hearings where your usual lawyers and connections won't be able to protect you. Sterling's hand moved unconsciously toward the cufflink, his mind reeling with the implications of having his private conversations recorded and weaponized against him. The device represented years of inadvertent self-incrimination, a documentary record of criminal activities that would make conviction a mere formality. The threat came naturally, reflexively, born from decades of using intimidation to solve problems that money and influence couldn't address. "I'll destroy you," Sterling snarled, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking under the pressure of facing someone who refused to be intimidated. "I'll have my people hunt you down like the worthless nobody you are. I'll make your life so miserable that you'll beg me to end your suffering." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Desperate bravado from a man whose power was evaporating in real time. Vivienne's response was to reach for a small remote control, activating recording devices that Sterling hadn't noticed concealed throughout the apartment. Red lights blinked to life like digital eyes, documenting every word of his threat for future use against him. She'd anticipated this moment, planned for his desperation, and turned even his attempts at intimidation into additional evidence of his criminal nature. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but Sterling was just beginning to understand how completely the roles had been reversed. "Mr. Whitmore," Vivienne said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone holding all the cards in a game her opponent hadn't realized they were playing. "You're already destroyed. The federal investigation has enough evidence to convict you 10 times over. Your business empire is collapsing, your allies have abandoned you, and your reputation is so damaged that even your own lawyers are probably planning how to distance themselves from the wreckage." She moved to her laptop, opening files that documented the scope of Sterling's criminal activities with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant. "I have 15 years of evidence, Mr. Whitmore. 15 years of recorded conversations, financial transactions, email intercepts, and testimony from victims you thought you'd silenced forever. You didn't just destroy me 3 years ago. You created your own nemesis and gave her all the motivation she needed to dedicate her life to bringing you down." Sterling stared at the screen, watching his own words and actions compiled into a digital monument to his corruption, understanding for the first time that his situation was truly hopeless. Vivienne Morrison had spent 3 years becoming the perfect instrument of his destruction, and she'd just finished explaining exactly how thoroughly she'd succeeded. Sterling's counterattack came with the desperate ferocity of a cornered animal, utilizing connections that he'd cultivated over decades of corrupt dealings to transform the hunter back into the hunted. Within hours of his confrontation with Vivienne, federal agents received an anonymous tip linking her to a terrorist cell, complete with fabricated evidence suggesting she'd been planning attacks on financial institutions as part of an anti-capitalist conspiracy. The accusation was absurd, unsupported by any credible evidence, but it served its purpose by forcing Vivienne underground while Sterling's allies in law enforcement pursued charges that would discredit her testimony and invalidate the evidence she'd gathered against him. The irony was bitter. Sterling was using the same corrupt system that had failed to protect Vivienne 3 years earlier, weaponizing federal agencies against someone whose only crime had been seeking justice through means the law had denied her. But Sterling had underestimated both Vivienne's preparation and her network of allies, failing to recognize that 3 years of planning had included contingencies for exactly this kind of retaliation. Evangeline Reed emerged from the shadows like an avenging angel, coordinating a media blitz that transformed Sterling's desperate gambit into a public relations catastrophe that further damaged his already tattered reputation. She'd spent months cultivating relationships with investigative journalists, federal prosecutors, and congressional staffers who specialized in corporate corruption cases, creating a network of allies who were ready to act when the moment arrived. The terrorism charges against Vivienne were quickly exposed as fabricated nonsense, supported by evidence so obviously manufactured that it raised serious questions about Sterling's remaining connections within federal law enforcement. The revelation that Sterling had attempted to frame a whistleblower for terrorism while facing his own federal investigation created a media firestorm that burned through his remaining credibility like acid through tissue paper. Editorial boards across the country condemned the obvious abuse of federal resources. Prosecutors announced investigations into the fabricated evidence, and Sterling found himself facing additional charges for obstruction of justice and making false statements to federal investigators. The leaked recordings continued surfacing like ghosts from Sterling's past, each new revelation more damaging than the last, painting a picture of systematic corruption that spanned decades and involved dozens of supposedly respectable business leaders. His conversation about making that idealistic bitch disappear permanently triggered a criminal investigation into whether Sterling had conspired to commit violence against his perceived enemies. The audio of him laughing about bribing federal judges sparked congressional hearings and judicial ethics investigations that threatened to bring down half the federal bench in the Southern District of New York. Most damaging was the recording where Sterling explicitly outlined his strategy for destroying whistleblowers. You don't just fire them, you destroy their entire lives. Make them unemployable, bankrupt, psychologically broken. Make them examples so that no one else will ever be stupid enough to cross us. The words had been spoken in a private meeting with his legal team, captured by the cufflink recording device that Sterling had worn to document potential betrayals by his own attorneys. The irony was perfect. His paranoia about others had created the evidence needed for his own destruction. Federal agents raided Sterling's offices at dawn, executing search warrants that had been signed by judges eager to distance themselves from any suggestion of corrupt dealings with the Whitmore empire. The perp walk footage dominated every news cycle, showing Sterling in handcuffs being led from his penthouse office, while federal prosecutors outlined charges that included wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and racketeering. The RICO charges were particularly devastating, allowing prosecutors to target Sterling's entire network of corrupt allies and seize assets that had been hidden through shell corporations and offshore accounts. His legal team abandoned him with the speed of rats fleeing a sinking ship, each departure further isolating him from the power structures that had protected him for so long. The man who'd once commanded respect through fear and intimidation now faced the prospect of dying in federal prison, his empire in ruins and his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the ultimate futility of building success on foundations of corruption and cruelty. Vivienne emerged from hiding as the terrorism charges collapsed under scrutiny, appearing at a federal courthouse surrounded by FBI agents who were now protecting rather than pursuing her. The press conference was carried live on every major network, giving her the platform to tell her story with the kind of compelling detail that transformed abstract concepts of corporate corruption into personal narrative that resonated with millions of viewers. She spoke with the calm authority of someone who'd survived hell and returned with evidence of the devils she'd encountered, describing Sterling's systematic retaliation against whistleblowers and the 3 years she'd spent building the case that was now destroying him. Sterling Whitmore represents everything wrong with our economic system, she said, her words carrying the weight of lived experience rather than academic theory. He built his fortune by destroying anyone who threatened his interests, convinced that his wealth made him untouchable and his victims too broken to fight back. Today, we prove that no one is above the law, that justice may be delayed, but it's never truly denied, and that sometimes the system works when good people refuse to give up. The congressional hearing that followed was broadcast live to the nation, giving Americans a front-row seat to watch Sterling Whitmore's complete humiliation at the hands of the woman he'd tried to destroy. Vivienne testified with the precision of a trained lawyer and the passion of someone seeking justice for herself and countless other victims, walking committee members through evidence that painted Sterling as the architect of a criminal conspiracy that had corrupted everything it touched. Sterling's own testimony was a disaster, his usual commanding presence replaced by the desperate evasions of someone whose lies were being exposed in real time. When confronted with audio recordings of his own voice describing illegal activities, he could only claim that the evidence was fabricated, a defense that collapsed when technical experts confirmed the authenticity of every recording. The moment that defined his fall came when Vivienne was asked to identify the man who had threatened to destroy her pathetic little life, and she pointed directly at Sterling while maintaining the same Arctic calm she'd displayed in the restaurant 3 months earlier. "That man taught me everything I know about patience, planning, and the importance of total victory over one's enemies. I'm grateful for the education." The verdict came after less than 6 hours of deliberation, the jury having been presented with evidence so overwhelming that the only real question was whether Sterling would receive multiple life sentences or simply enough time to ensure he died in federal prison. The judge's words echoed through the packed courtroom with the finality of a death sentence. "Mr. Whitmore, you have been convicted of leading a criminal enterprise that corrupted our financial system, destroyed innocent lives, and undermined the very foundations of fair dealing that make capitalism possible. Your crimes span decades, your victims number in the thousands, and your complete lack of remorse demonstrates that you remain a danger to society." Sterling listened to his fate with the hollow expression of someone whose entire identity had been stripped away, reduced from master of the universe to just another federal prisoner whose name would be remembered only as a cautionary tale. As federal marshals led him away in chains, Sterling caught sight of Vivienne in the gallery, watching his downfall with the satisfaction of someone who'd kept a promise to herself and delivered justice when the system had failed to provide it. The asset forfeiture proceedings that followed dismantled Sterling's empire piece by piece, redistributing billions of dollars in stolen wealth to the victims of his various schemes and fraudulent enterprises. Vivienne received a substantial settlement that compensated her for the 3 years of her life that Sterling had stolen, though money was never the point of her campaign for justice. The real victory was watching a corrupt system forced to confront its own failures, seeing powerful people held accountable for their crimes, and proving that patient determination could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. Sterling Whitmore had built his fortune by convincing people that resistance was futile, that his wealth and connections made him invulnerable to consequences. His downfall proved that some people refuse to be intimidated, that justice can emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that sometimes the victims of systemic corruption possess the intelligence and determination necessary to burn the entire system down and rebuild it according to more equitable principles. The nationwide investigation that followed Sterling's conviction swept through corporate America like a cleansing fire, consuming decades of carefully hidden corruption with the ruthless efficiency of federal prosecutors armed with unimpeachable evidence and unlimited resources. The recordings from Sterling's cufflink had implicated dozens of supposedly respectable business leaders, federal judges, and government officials in a web of corruption so extensive that it required a special prosecutor and a dedicated task force to handle the sheer volume of criminal activity. CEOs who'd ruled their industries with imperial arrogance found themselves perp-walked in front of television cameras, their empires collapsing as investors fled anything connected to the spreading scandal. The stock market convulsed through daily revelations about systematic fraud, market manipulation, and regulatory capture. But the underlying economy proved resilient as corrupt enterprises were replaced by competitors who actually followed the law. America was witnessing the kind of systemic cleansing that occurred once in a generation. The painful but necessary process of excising cancerous growth from institutions that had forgotten their proper purpose. Sterling's final gambit came from his federal prison cell, a desperate attempt to escape the consequences of his actions by fleeing to a non-extradition country where his remaining hidden assets could fund a comfortable exile. The plan required corrupting federal marshals, bribing airport officials, and coordinating with international money launderers who specialized in helping wealthy criminals disappear from justice. It was exactly the kind of scheme that Sterling had orchestrated countless times for other people, using his wealth and connections to purchase outcomes that should have been impossible. But his network of corrupt allies had been systematically dismantled by the ongoing federal investigation. His assets were frozen under RICO statutes, and his remaining loyalists were more concerned with saving themselves than rescuing their fallen leader. The escape attempt that should have been executed with precision and stealth instead became a comedy of errors that provided additional evidence of Sterling's ongoing criminal mindset. The private airfield in New Jersey was supposed to be Sterling's gateway to freedom, a discreet departure point where wealth could purchase anonymity and justice could be permanently evaded. Federal surveillance had been tracking the escape plan for weeks, allowing law enforcement to document every aspect of the conspiracy, while gathering evidence that would send Sterling's remaining allies to prison for decades. Vivienne arrived at the airfield ahead of the arrest team, determined to confront Sterling one final time before he disappeared forever into the comfortable exile that his money could still provide. She wanted to see his face when he realized that even his most desperate gambit had been anticipated and countered, that his supposed genius for escape and evasion had been outmatched by someone who'd learned from his own methods. The confrontation would be dangerous. Sterling was desperate and surrounded by men whose loyalty had been purchased rather than earned. But Vivienne needed this moment of closure, this final proof that justice was not just theoretical but personal, immediate, and absolute. Sterling emerged from the black sedan with the furtive urgency of someone who understood that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. His usual commanding presence replaced by the paranoid desperation of a fugitive who'd already mentally adjusted to life as an exile and criminal. The private jet waited on the tarmac like a symbol of purchased freedom, its engines already spinning up for immediate departure to a country where extradition treaties were more theoretical than practical. He was traveling light, carrying only essential documents and access codes to offshore accounts that had somehow escaped federal seizure, prepared to abandon everything he'd built in exchange for avoiding the federal prison sentence that awaited him in America. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms and terrorized opponents was now reduced to sneaking around airports like a common criminal. His transformation complete, but his arrogance still intact. He still believed that wealth could solve any problem, that consequences were for other people, that his intelligence and resources made him superior to the justice system that had finally caught up with him. Vivienne stepped from the shadows like an avenging spirit, her presence transforming Sterling's carefully planned escape into a moment of reckoning that he'd been desperately trying to avoid. "Going somewhere, Mr. Whitmore?" she asked, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had marked their previous encounters, though now it was backed by the knowledge that justice had been served and Sterling's power permanently broken. Sterling's face cycled through surprise, fear, and finally a rage so pure that it seemed to burn the air around him. He'd spent months in federal custody fantasizing about revenge against the woman who destroyed his life, imagining the various ways he could make her pay for her audacity in challenging his authority. But standing face to face with her in the shadow of his failed escape attempt, Sterling realized that Vivienne Morrison had outplayed him so completely that even his dreams of revenge were exercises in futility. "You destroyed everything," Sterling snarled, his composure finally cracking completely to reveal the petulant child that had always lurked beneath his carefully maintained facade of sophisticated authority. "My business, my reputation, my entire life's work. You burned it all down because you couldn't accept that sometimes people lose. Sometimes the system doesn't work the way naive idealists think it should." His words carried the bitter resentment of someone who'd never learned to accept responsibility for his actions, who viewed consequences as personal attacks rather than natural responses to criminal behavior. Vivienne listened with the detached fascination of someone observing a psychological case study, marveling at Sterling's complete inability to understand that his downfall was self-inflicted, that every action she'd taken against him had been defensive rather than aggressive, He'd destroyed his own life through decades of criminal behavior. She'd simply documented his crimes and presented the evidence to appropriate authorities. The fact that he saw himself as a victim rather than a perpetrator revealed a level of self-delusion that was almost clinically fascinating. "I didn't destroy anything, Mr. Whitmore," Vivienne replied, her words carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty. "You built your empire on foundations of fraud and cruelty, convinced that your victims would stay buried and your crimes would remain hidden. All I did was shine light on what you'd kept in darkness, give voice to people you'd tried to silence, and prove that no one is above the law." Her response seemed to deflate Sterling's rage, replacing it with something that might have been recognition or despair. For the first time in decades, Sterling Whitmore was forced to confront the possibility that his victims had been right, that his success had been built on injustice, that his entire life's work had been dedicated to making the world a worse place. The revelation was devastating to someone whose identity had been constructed around the belief that success justified any means necessary to achieve it. Vivienne watched emotions play across his features like weather patterns, seeing the exact moment when Sterling's self-image finally collided with reality and shattered beyond repair. The federal agents emerged from concealment with the synchronized precision of a military operation, surrounding Sterling and his associates with overwhelming force that made resistance both futile and suicidal. Sterling's loyal bodyguards surrendered without firing a shot, their purchased loyalty proving insufficient when confronted with federal arrest warrants and automatic weapons. The escape conspiracy collapsed like a house of cards, each participant quickly agreeing to testify against the others in exchange for reduced sentences. Sterling himself was taken into custody with additional charges that would ensure he never again saw freedom, his desperate gambit having provided prosecutors with evidence of ongoing criminal enterprise and flight risk that eliminated any possibility of plea negotiation or reduced sentencing. As federal marshals placed him in restraints for the final time, Sterling looked at Vivienne with something that might have been respect or hatred, though the distinction no longer mattered to either of them. "You won," Sterling said quietly, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose entire world had been reduced to rubble. "I underestimated you, underestimated what someone could accomplish when they had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from my destruction. You played a better game than I did, used my own methods against me more effectively than I ever used them against my enemies." The admission was as close to an apology as Sterling was capable of offering, though Vivienne understood that his regret was tactical rather than moral, focused on his failure rather than his crimes. As the federal convoy departed for the final time, taking Sterling back to a prison cell where he would spend the remainder of his life, Vivienne felt the weight of 3 years' planning finally lifting from her shoulders. Justice had been served, not through the systems that had failed her initially, but through the patient application of intelligence, determination, and moral clarity against an opponent who'd forgotten that even predators could become prey when they encountered someone more skilled at the game they thought they'd mastered. 6 months after Sterling Whitmore's final conviction, Vivienne Morrison stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee as the morning sun streamed through the chamber's tall windows, transforming the hearing room into a stage where truth and justice could finally claim victory over corruption and greed. The senators arrayed before her represented the best and worst of American democracy, some genuinely committed to reform, while others were secretly calculating how Sterling's downfall might affect their own questionable relationships with corporate donors. But the cameras were rolling. The transcript would become part of the permanent record, and Vivienne's testimony would reach millions of Americans who'd been waiting for someone to speak truth to power with the authority that came from having personally dismantled one of the most corrupt enterprises in modern history. She wore a simple blue suit that projected competence without ostentation, her appearance calibrated to remind viewers that justice could emerge from ordinary people who refused to accept extraordinary corruption as normal business practice. Her opening statement was delivered with the precision of a trained prosecutor and the passion of someone who'd sacrificed 3 years of her life to prove that the system could be forced to work when good people refused to give up. "Sterling Whitmore was not an aberration," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics while cameras captured every word for broadcast to a nation hungry for accountability. He was the logical product of a system that rewards greed, protects wealth, and punishes anyone brave enough to expose corruption. For every Sterling Whitmore who gets caught, there are dozens of others who continue operating with impunity, confident that their money and connections make them untouchable. The words landed like physical blows on senators who'd built careers on corporate donations, forcing them to confront the possibility that their own relationships with wealthy donors might not survive the kind of scrutiny that Vivienne had applied to Sterling's criminal enterprise. Her testimony was simultaneously an indictment of the past and a blueprint for the future, outlining reforms that would make Sterling-style corruption impossible while protecting whistleblowers from the kind of retaliation she'd endured. The foundation that bore Vivienne's name occupied a restored brownstone in Washington, D.C., its mission statement carved into marble in the lobby: protecting those who protect justice. The Morrison Foundation for Whistleblower Protection had been funded by Sterling's forfeited assets, creating a delicious irony that his stolen wealth would now be used to protect future victims from predators who operated according to his methods. Evangeline Reed served as the foundation's executive director, bringing the same methodical intelligence to protecting whistleblowers that she'd once applied to destroying Sterling's financial empire. Their law firm specialized in cases that traditional attorneys wouldn't touch, representing people whose only crime had been telling the truth about powerful individuals who preferred darkness to light. The work was difficult, dangerous, and occasionally heartbreaking, but it provided concrete proof that Sterling's downfall had created something larger than personal revenge. Justice wasn't just theoretical, it was practical, immediate, and available to anyone with the courage to seek it. The prison visit was unnecessary but symbolically important, a final chapter in a story that had consumed 3 years of Vivienne's life and defined her transformation from victim to victor. Sterling occupied a small cell in the administrative segregation unit of the federal penitentiary, his isolation a consequence of the threats he'd received from other inmates whose own criminal enterprises had been damaged by the investigation his downfall had triggered. Age had settled on him like dust, transforming the commanding presence she remembered into something shrunken and bitter, though his eyes still burned with the same arrogance that had defined his approach to business and life. The federal prison system had stripped away everything artificial about Sterling Whitmore, revealing the small, petty man who'd hidden behind wealth and influence for so long. He looked up when Vivienne entered the visiting room, his face cycling through surprise, resignation, and something that might have been relief at finally facing his nemesis without pretense or possibility of escape. "I know why you're here," Sterling said without preamble, his voice carrying the flat effect of someone whose emotional range had been compressed by years of institutional routine and enforced irrelevance. "You want to gloat, to see how the mighty have fallen, to confirm that justice has been served and balance has been restored to the universe." His words carried traces of his old rhetorical skill, but the authority that had once made them dangerous was gone, replaced by the hollow echo of someone whose power had been permanently broken. Vivienne studied him with the clinical interest of someone examining a solved equation, noting how prison had revealed aspects of his personality that wealth and influence had previously obscured. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms now struggled to command even his own emotional responses, reduced from master of the universe to just another federal prisoner whose existence was measured in institutional routines and visiting privileges. "Actually," Vivienne replied, settling into the plastic chair across from Sterling's position at the scarred metal table, "I wanted to tell you that I'm grateful, not for what you did to me, that was inexcusable and criminal, but for what you taught me about the importance of patience, preparation, and complete victory over one's enemies." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Sterling was still intelligent enough to parse despite his diminished circumstances. Vivienne had learned from studying his methods, had applied his own strategic principles against him, had used his arrogance and assumptions as weapons in her campaign for justice. The student had surpassed the teacher by remembering that power without moral foundation was ultimately self-destructing, that empires built on corruption contained the seeds of their own destruction. Sterling's greatest weakness had been his inability to imagine that his victims might possess the intelligence and determination necessary to bring him down through the same systematic approach he'd used against them. Sterling's response came after a long silence, his words carrying the weight of someone whose entire worldview had been forced to accommodate uncomfortable truths. "There are others like me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, though the visiting room was empty except for guards who'd heard similar conversations countless times before. "Powerful people who learned from my mistakes, who are already adapting their methods to avoid the kind of exposure that destroyed me. You won this battle, Vivienne, but the war between justice and corruption never ends. There will always be another predator, another system to corrupt, another group of victims who need someone with your skills to protect them." The admission was as close to wisdom as Sterling was capable of achieving, though Vivienne understood that his warning came from strategic calculation rather than genuine concern for future victims. He wanted her to understand that her victory, however complete, was ultimately limited by the system that had produced him and would inevitably produce others like him. Vivienne smiled for the first time during their conversation, the expression carrying none of the warmth that genuine happiness might produce, but all of the satisfaction that came from hearing an enemy acknowledge the scope of their defeat. "I know," she said simply, rising from her chair with the fluid grace of someone who'd found her purpose and intended to pursue it until her last breath. "That's why this is just the beginning." The words echoed Sterling's own farewell from 3 years earlier, when he'd believed that destroying her career would end their relationship permanently. Instead, his retaliation had created something far more dangerous than the idealistic lawyer who'd first challenged his authority. It had forged a weapon specifically designed for hunting predators who believed themselves untouchable. As Vivienne walked away from Sterling Whitmore for the final time, she carried with her the knowledge that his greatest crime hadn't been the fraud or the corruption or the systematic destruction of innocent lives. His greatest crime had been teaching her that sometimes justice required more than faith in institutional solutions. Sometimes it required the patient, methodical application of superior intelligence against inferior moral reasoning. The case files that covered Vivienne's desk represented the future of her war against systematic corruption. Dozens of situations where powerful people were using wealth and influence to escape consequences that ordinary citizens would face without question. Each file contained a story of institutional failure, of victims abandoned by systems that claimed to protect them, of predators who'd learned from Sterling's mistakes and adapted their methods accordingly. But they'd also created their own nemesis, someone whose understanding of their psychology had been forged in the fires of personal experience and tempered by 3 years of patient planning. Vivienne Morrison was no longer the idealistic young lawyer who'd believed that truth was sufficient protection against corruption. She'd become something far more dangerous, a hunter who understood her prey completely and possessed both the skills and the motivation necessary to bring justice to those who believed themselves above the law. The phone rang with news of another case, another victim, another opportunity to prove that some debts could only be paid in full. Sterling Whitmore's legacy would be measured not just in the lives he'd destroyed, but in the weapon his destruction had created for protecting future victims from predators who still believed that wealth was stronger than justice. The end. Sterling Whitmore spent the remainder of his life in federal prison, his empire dismantled and his wealth redistributed to his victims. The Morrison Foundation continues to protect whistleblowers and fight corruption, proving that sometimes the best response to systematic injustice is systematic justice. For those watching from anywhere in the world, the lesson is clear. No one is too powerful to face consequences, no victim is too broken to seek justice, and sometimes the most ordinary people possess the extraordinary determination necessary to change the world.